Hi, I'm Britta, my pronouns are she, her, hers, and this video is about how to know if you're transgender. I know there's a ton of videos like this out there on YouTube, so bear with me. There's some things that you really need to understand first, and one of them is a lot of things that people associate with gender don't have a gender. For example, clothing doesn't have a gender, makeup doesn't have a gender, and a lot of times I hear trans people refer to themselves when they were kids and say, oh yeah, I always used to wear boys' clothes, so I always knew I was trans. And that discussion really kind of rubs me the wrong way, in that if you're AFAB and you used to wear clothing associated with the boys section as a kid, which I did because they were more comfortable, I guess, it implies that other people who wore clothing associated with the opposite gender they were assigned at birth must also be trans or have some kind of trans experience, which is complete bull. You know, there are plenty of cis-identifying butch women who used to wear and still do wear clothes from the boys section or the men's section, and that doesn't make them any more or less trans. What I do understand from this argument, though, is that instead of saying, yes, I wore these clothes, so I must be trans, I think the idea behind that narrative is more, I wore these clothes because I understood the social implications of this representing my maleness to me, using the example I used earlier. So it's not actually, I wore boys' clothes as a kid, so I must be trans. It's, I wore boys' clothes because I understood that these were clothes associated with the gender that I associated with myself. But a lot of these classical trans narratives kind of skip over that part, and there's a lot of articles out at the moment that kind of talk about how people who are trying to really be allies of the trans community are starting to erase cisgender, gender non-conforming people's experiences in assuming that they have a trans experience. Anyway, that was a really super long ramble, and the point of that was, how do I know if I'm trans? Well, don't try and think too hard about what you wore as a kid or, you know, what toys you like to play with. Think more about if you did have an experience like that, you know, why? I used to play with Lego because I bloody loved Lego. Also, Lego used to be marketed as more gender neutral anyway, so that's not a good example. I don't know, I used to skateboard not because I thought this is a thing associated with boys and I want to be a boy, but because I like skateboarding. And so I never bring things up like that to kind of support my trans narrative, if that makes any sense. So what I'm saying is, if you think that that might have had some influence on your trans identity, then say, I used to dress this way because I wanted to express my inner gender identity, and don't make it about the hobbies or the clothes or the makeup or whatever, you know, because there are plenty of people who do these things. I know Jaden Smith, for example, very much identifies as male as far as I know, but he just really loves wearing skirts. Plenty of guys wear makeup and are still guys, like, okay, so how do I know if I'm trans? There are also other things you need to realize as well, is that there's no one way to be trans, which is quite obvious. And there's a lot of focus on the trans narrative of being about gender dysphoria, and there's this push in kind of, especially I think the non-binary trans community, to discuss transness coming from a perspective of gender euphoria as opposed to gender dysphoria, which is less about like, I hate XYZ about my body, I want to change it, or I hate XYZ about the way society perceives me in regards to names and pronouns, I want to change this, and more about, for example, I don't mind my breasts, but I'd be a lot happier with a flat chest, or I don't mind my voice, but I'd be a lot happier with a deeper voice or a higher voice or whatever. And I think this kind of idea that's grown out of the medicalization of trans identities is that we want to minimize discomfort, as a lot of medical situations would require. But in saying that, I think, like, it's only very recently that we're coming away from the medicalization of trans identities, and even in a lot of places we haven't yet. Like, I had to get a diagnosis of gender dysphoria before I could get top surgery. A psychiatrist had to diagnose me as being gender dysphoric. And we really, I think, need to move away from that, because the idea of the focus on gender dysphoria and not gender euphoria kind of subtracts from the idea that we're allowed to be really American of me, pursue our own happiness. You know, there are plenty of people who are okay with how they are now, but they'd be much happier in a different situation, and kind of denying them the right or the space to transition because they're okay as they are now and they don't have excruciatingly emotional discomfort is really regressive, I think, because, you know, if someone knows what they can do to make themselves happier and they want to do it, but they need a psychiatrist to kind of measure how unhappy they are with themselves and their body right now, I think that's problematic. There's a really good article by Ozzy Mandias, which is called Transness as a Choice, which I will link to in this video because it's bloody ace. And it's about how, okay, they start off, I've seen a lot of people say things along the lines of, if you've ever thought about being trans, you are trans. And cis people don't question whether they're trans. To me, this seems both wrong and harmful. Of course there are people who question whether they're trans or not and decide that being trans isn't right for them. And then they go on to talk about, for example, a butch person wondering whether they're actually trans or not, and kind of deciding that no, it's because of the expectation society has on them for being female, which is completely valid. And the key idea in this article, which I think is really important, is, so one of the things I've been trying to do lately is to switch from framing transness as an identity to framing it as a choice, which I see a lot of people worry about this because they think that it'll give transphobes cannon fodder, right? If transness is a choice, then obviously it's not something you're born with, it's not something inherent, and therefore it's something you could just not do. And they see being trans as inherently negative. And a lot of people who are trying to win these transphobic people over think that if we frame it as something you're born with, then they'll have to eventually accept it as a kind of concrete human differentiation. And of course it is a concrete human differentiation. There are histories of gender non-conforming and, like, what we'd call today transgender people, even though there are many other words for them in societies way back and around the world and in many cultures, that have been accepted until white people came along with our bloody Christianity and told them that that was bad. Fuck, colonization. I mean, this is why I hate the born this way idea in regards to LGB identities as well, and I made a video on this like 5 years ago, or 4 years ago, yeah, about how annoyed I was at this born this way rhetoric, because it's very apologetic and it's catering to cis-het normative ideas about what it means to be and what it's okay to do with your body. And I think there are some really interesting discussions in here to be had, and we could go on all day about it. But in the end, there are plenty of ways to explore your gender without making any permanent decisions. And so I'd really, you know, advise to do that if you really don't know and you're struggling with this. I've mentioned before on my channel, I went by the name Zach for 2 years because I thought I might be a binary trans guy. Also, as a note, even if you are a binary trans guy, there is absolutely no pressure to change your name whatsoever. I know a trans woman called Zach. I know plenty of trans people who have names not associated traditionally with their gender identity, and that's totally fine. You know, like if your name's Bethany and you're a guy, then you're a guy called Bethany, sweet as. But so for me, I felt like being known as Zach would kind of give me a space to explore a more male identity. And this is going back to what I said at the start. It's not because Zach in itself is a male name, even though it's often associated as such, but it's because I knew that it was associated as such and I wanted to explore the social implications of that. Which is, it seems really roundabout and like really kind of getting into some nitty-gritty details. You might say, Britta, why does anyone care? But I think it's important to know that. Yeah, so if you don't know whether you're trans and you're struggling with this idea, think of it as a choice rather than an inherent identity. Would I be happier if I did X, Y, Z? Whatever. And like I said, there are plenty of temporary things you can do to explore this. And if you decide you're not trans, then sweet as, they're all temporary. Obviously, once you get into the more permanent things, you know, there's more of a conversation to be had around that. I personally don't have anything against people who take hormones for a while, decide that's not for them. People who have I've not known anyone who had surgery and then regretted it. I have known people who have taken hormones and not necessarily regretted it, but decided that it's not something they wanted to do long term. Anyway, am I trans? If you don't know, not me, you. Are you trans? If you don't know, you know, there's no harm, I think, in accepting situations, in accepting mostly queer spaces, I guess. There's no harm in saying, hey, I'm questioning my gender identity. Could you perhaps try using they, them, theirs pronouns for me for a while? And I just want to see how it feels. And I honestly think, especially amongst my friends, for example, a lot of people would be really accommodating to that. And then if, you know, a few months later I thought, oh no, I'm not really feeling this, it doesn't feel right, then I can just say, hey everyone, you know, I want to go back to she, her, hers, or whatever your original pronouns were. Or, this isn't working for me, how about we try he, him, his. I'm using pronouns as an example because, just because, but you can do this with anything, like names and anything else. I might do a video later about, like, changing your voice without hormones. Like, there's a lot of things you can do in regards to gender presentation that a lot of people don't think about. And for example, I could speak like this all the time and I'd probably get picked out as male on the phone, and now you probably think that I sound really silly or like I'm kind of taking the piss, but to be honest, I could speak like this all day, I could speak like this for weeks, and after a while the fact that I was using a deeper register would not be as obvious. Obviously right now I'm doing it really purposefully, but after a while it would start feeling really natural. And I actually did this for a while. You kind of have to reach this register. I think you need to do a few voice exercises first, because when I first started trying this, my voice would crack a bit, which was quite funny. I sounded like I was going through puberty, which I was not. But for example, I could think, okay, I want a deeper voice, but I really, really, really don't want facial hair, or some of the other things associated with T, so I'm just gonna try to focus on this one particular thing that I want to change about myself. And if I don't like this, then I can always go back, and that'll be fine. So I'm going to do another video, because I realize this is already getting quite long, about the things you can do in regards to transition. I think a lot of people approaching this question, am I trans, especially if you haven't been in the community a lot, it kind of seems like an either or thing. Either you do the full trans thing, like have you fully transitioned, or you don't at all. And I'm going to make a video about how you can really approach it as a checklist. I'm actually going to make a checklist where there's individual things you can change about yourself. I know plenty of non-binary people who have kept their names and pronouns and everything, and they're non-binary, and that's sweet as. But you know, I think there are some non-binary people who are more focused on the physicality of it, and so I'm gonna look at approaching your transition as a checklist rather than a pre-packaged deal. Yeah, so that was just an example of something that you can do and play around with and test out. And I mean, at the start you do feel kind of silly. Like, I felt really silly being known as Zach for the first few months because I'd never been a Zach before. I didn't know what that meant for me, you know? And, you know, after a couple of years I realized it wasn't something that I wanted. I like Britta. Britta's good.